And by way of introduction, because I don't know everybody that's logged in here, I assume you have folks that you've invited, Cantor. But I'll just do a brief introduction that we're welcoming Cantor Osterklein to give the first of four classes that he's got scheduled. I believe it's what month? Is it weekly from now on? Once a week?
Weekly. It's this series is weekly for 4 weeks, and then when I come starting in December, there'll be December 29th. There'll be another 4 week course in person.
How do you spell weekly?
You tell me at the end of the first one. It'll be up to you.
And so I'm going to ask people to mute until the Cantor asks you to unmute. And I think he's going to do a little participative thing here today. I don't know how many people are in the social hall at the synagogue. I just have a picture of a microphone. But I also know that there have been some difficulties this morning with the internet. And so I don't know if they'll be able to stay on. But I'll go ahead and find that link and send it to everyone for the paper that you sent out.
Very good. Well, thank you to Elliot for being the Lord of Hosts, as it were. If you as he is for so many Zoom programs at TBS, and he's going to drop in the chat a copy of the source sheet that we'll use a little later today. You can see he just did. Thank you very much. And then I will also be screen sharing it, so it'll be a little easier for folks at home to follow along, whether you have the PDF in front of you or not. I will also ask, there will be some reading of several paragraphs of biblical text. And so those of you who enjoy reading the English language, and particularly scripture, please think to yourself, oh, maybe I want to volunteer for this. And when I call for volunteers, I'll hopefully one and or more of you will help us out to read some of our texts for today. So in the spirit of Albert Einstein, who actually sometimes had musicians travel with him on his lectures, I'm going to start with a song. So you can sing this along with me, just in the nigun, and then I'll throw the words in, and you can hum with me or do the words if you know them. I nai 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 na na nai 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 I nai 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 I na na nai 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 I nai nai I nai nai I na na nai 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 I nai I nai 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 I na na nai 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 nai. Try that with me. I nai nai I nai nai na na nai nai I nai 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 I nai 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 I na na nai 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 I nai I nai I na na nai nai I nai 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 I nai 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 I na nai 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 na na nai nai nai. Lots of Hasidic Igunim have this bridge that's like two bars between the A and the B section. Ya na na nai 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 B section. I na na nai nai na na nai 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 I nai nai na nai 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 I na na nai nai na na nai 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 I nai nai na nai 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 nai. Let's try that. I na na nai nai na na nai 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 I nai nai na nai 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 nai. And the beat second time through that section is different. Listen, only 3 bars. I na na nai nai na na nai 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 ay 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 na nai 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 I na na nai 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 I na na nai 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 I nai 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 na 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 nai ay 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 amma da nai 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 na na nai 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 I na na nai nai na na nai 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 I nai nai na nai 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 I Ay na 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 na. Ay 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 yamba da na 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 na. Ay na 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 ay na na ay na na ay na 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 na. If you know these words, you can add them. The words are from King David, who the inauguration of the Levites, he wrote these words for them to begin their service. Shiru lo zameru lo sichu bechol nifleotav. Shiru lo zameru lo sichu bechol niflotav. Shiru lo zameru lo sichu bechol nifleotav. Shiru lo zameru lo sichu bechol niflotav. Yananai, hitalelu, beshem kodsho, yismach lev mevakshe Adonai. Hitalelu, beshem kodsho, yismach lev mevakshe Adonai. Shiru lo zameru lo, sichu bechol nifleotav. Shiru lo zameru lo, sichu bechol niflotav. Shiru lo zamru lo, sichu bechol nivleotav. Shiru lo zamru lo, sichu bechol nivleotav. Thank you, everybody. It's good to start with King David's going to be part of today's program, so it's good to start with some of his words. The melody's mine. As I welcome you all to this series on disruptive innovation in Jewish music history. Not disruptive microphones, but disruptive innovation in Jewish music history. Can you all hear me okay? With my NPR microphone, I will try to use my best NPR voice. It was such a pleasure to be with so many of you at the High Holy Days. It was certainly a Yamim Noraim, days of awe and sometimes fear. But I hope all of you are well and that your homes are mostly restored to their original states, and that you're excited for the year ahead. I certainly am, and I'm happy to be joining you for the next 4 weeks of learning online here. But first, let me give an introduction to this theme of disruptive innovation, which sort of comes from the business world, and why it matters. And then we're going to go into today's sources on the biblical era, which will frame our questions about music and how it disrupts society and disrupts or expresses our innermost being, or change the way we think about God, these kind of big questions that we'll deal with in the next coming weeks. I will speak for about 45 minutes, and just to let you know, my talks usually run between 60 and we'll have 15 minutes at the end. My talks usually run into the 75-minute range, if that's okay. If it's not, we'll retune for other weeks to make it that 60-minute slot. So I will speak for about 45 minutes, but in the middle, I will need some bold readers to read some biblical texts. So again, think to yourselves if you're in that category of human being who would like to do that. And I'll ask once more, Elliot, if you would just, for any latecomers, if you would just put the PDF in the chat one more time, sometime in the next 5 minutes, as sometimes people come on and they don't see it. All right. Very good. Now, to introduce the subject. When you go to shul or you go to like Jewish concerts, sometimes orchestra concerts are like this too. We get a very traditional, heroic narrative of music. It's a feel-good narrative, especially if you're a classical music lover. The typical synagogue concert narrative, I and some of you heard me talk about a little of this my first time out, so forgive me if this is repetition, but repetition is the best way of learning. That's why it says, Vishinantam levanecha. You shall repeat the words of Torah to your children and speak them to them. So I call the typical narrative of a Jewish concert, Temple Till Today. The short version goes a little like this. In biblical times, Jews were very musical indeed, and they sang psalms while playing musical instruments in praise of God, especially the superstar king of Israel, King David, the man who played the sacred chord that pleased the Lord. The height of Jewish musical achievement was, of course, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, which featured glorious orchestral and choral music performed by the large and complex ensembles of the Levites and priests. But then, all of this musical glory was lost with the destruction of the Second Temple, after which the rabbis outlawed musical instruments on Shabbat and festivals because of mourning, Oy mehayalonu, and atonement for that destruction. Though they slowly warmed up to, instruments for Purim and weddings. Now the narrative, the concert narrative, usually skips from the destruction of the temple about 15 centuries to Italy, Mantua, in Venice in 1623, where the Italian Jewish composer Salomone Rossi became the first Jew to thoroughly and successfully compose Western choral music for the synagogue. There were 3 other guys, by the way, but he was the one who really published and got his stuff out there. So we're in 1623. Then the concert narrative skips another 2 centuries to the reforms, the moderate reforms of Salomon Sulzer in Vienna, who together with Louis Lewandowski in Berlin and Samuel Naumburg in Paris brought choirs and vocal sophistication streaming back into the synagogue qua temple, all while preserving the essence of tradition. Then after that comes the Golden Age cantors. We have Cantor Simon, who presents on these guys who are amazing. And the Golden Age cantors of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who achieved new virtuosic heights and gained worldwide fame as recording artists and cultural icons among Jews in Western culture. And then finally, our own time, the 1950s until today, with the rise of the fully professionalized cantor, complete with graduate degree and integration into synagogue life as an all-round clergyman, balancing popular trends with a traditional chant, musical excellence, and high sacred artistry, a balance which we are all sworn to conserve and protect. Anyone heard this at a concert before? Some version of this? Temple back then, temple now. It's a sort of Jewish musical salvation history on how we began with Jewish musical sophistication in the temple and how we have now regained it in a modern way. We've not only brought musical sophistication into the synagogue in a way that is evocative of the temple's complexity, but we've also taken over the classical music world, Leonard Bernstein being the rabbi of classical music to the entire world. So you can understand why cantors love singing, right? Please rebuild the temple in our day. It's the telos. It's the goal of the whole Jewish music concert narrative. Get our sophisticated musical groove back like in the days of the Holy Temple. So it's a cool narrative. But of course, there are some problems with the narrative. Not just that it's a little limited, it's mostly focused on Ashkenazic Jews, though the people in the temple and Salomon Rossi were not Ashkenazic Jews, but that's something else. It is pretty biased, I would say, towards written musical notation and Western musical literacy, right? And the musical institutions, which are based on its mastery, like choirs and orchestras and schools. Despite the fact that most of Jewish history, music has been orally transmitted, right? How do you learn to daven? You don't look at a book, you go to shul. And that's how it was for a very long time. And then lastly, it's too clean. This is too clean of a story. Ever hear people try to do these nice, clean biographies of classical composers? You can't write a clean biography about Mozart. You definitely can't write one about Wagner. But even Bach, we hear about Johann Sebastian Bach. We have some Bach fans in the crowd today. Raise your hand if you're a Bach fan. I'm a Bach fan. Good. Bach was the most sophisticated composers in Western classical history. You look at a Beethoven manuscript, it is a mess. You look at a Bach manuscript, it is pristine, crystal clear. Why? Because it was all up here. It was all organized, perfectly orchestrated in his head before he wrote it down. Brilliant man. But we don't hear about the Johann Sebastian Bach who pulled a knife on a fellow musician during a street fight. We don't hear about how he had tax-free beer as one of his provisions of his contract under the Duke of Saxony, and that he billed his church once for a trip, a 2-week trip for beer specifically, in an amount of money that would have purchased 8 gallons of beer. And we don't hear about the Johann Sebastian Bach, who had significant disciplinary problems, called incorrigible by his counselors in Leipzig. So, realistically, and I think this is true about our own musical figures, like King David especially, music has a very, the musical leaders and figures actually have a much more complex backgrounds often than we think. And that is because of the complex relationship between music and society. When music has a function really of being an agent of expression, which sometimes goes into the realm of transgression, of being a little over the top of what is normative or even moral in some cases. And also music being an engine of social change. That the forms of music that we choose are actually embodying ways that human beings relate to another. It's a very, you can't be part of a choir without liking hierarchy just a little bit, right? Because you have to take direction from a conductor. Similarly, if you don't like hierarchy, you probably might like a rock band a lot, or a jazz ensemble, because those are relational. They don't require authority from the top down, but they're a lot less stable, right? Rock bands kind of come in and out of existence with more frequency than, say, the Stetigkeit, the officialness of a choir or an orchestra. So I just want to emphasize, this is one of the themes that we'll be tracking across the experience of music in Jewish life over the next 4 weeks, that different forms of music are subtly or loudly suggesting different models of community, authority, and even God. So buckle up. We got 4 weeks of this. We're going to take actually quite familiar stops on the Temple Till Today narrative that I outlined for you. And we're going to see how they diverge a little from your average concert program. With that, let's get to our first text of today. We'll be studying 2 things. The second is the Davidic reformation of temple worship. King David totally changed the game with his introduction of the orchestra and all these big musical forces. But first we have to go back to the beginning, to the origins of music and musical instruments in the Torah. And it's appropriate that this week is Parshat Bereshit. We'll be reading this in synagogue in just 2 days. This is from Genesis 4, the generations of Cain. I would like to have a reader manifest as I do, just like we did in the old country. I will do the sharing of the screen. Okay, here we go. Can alle Yidden see the screen? Good. All right. So I will try to scroll generously in order that thou mayest read. But also, Elliot has put this in the chat. Would someone from the Zoom read this first source? It is long, but please read the whole page. What we're looking at is right after Cain kills Abel, and God condemns Cain to wander the world. This is the accounting of the next 7 generations of his line. And especially when we get to generation 6 and 7, we get to see what innovations his family is bringing into the world. Okay. May I get a reader? Can unmute and say, I will read, and then read.
Say, I will read.
Who is my reader? Say your name. Do we have a reader?
I'll read it.
Who's that?
It's Serenay. I'll be happy to read.
Thank you, Serenay.
Okay, where would you like me to start?
Start at Cain left the presence of the Lord, and I'll try to move down if you're reading off the screen.
Oh, I have a sheet.
Oh, great. Then go all the way to the end.
I have a sheet. Cain left the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. He then founded a city and named the city after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Arad, and Arad begot Mehujal, and Mehujal begot Methuselah, and Methuselah begot Lamech. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was the ancestor of those who dwell in tents and amidst herds. And the name of his brother was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all who play the lyre and the flute. As for Zillah, she bore Tubal-Cain, who forged all implements of copper and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. O wives of Lamech, give ear to my speech. I have slain a man for wounding me, and a lad for bruising me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 70-fold, 77-fold. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, meaning, God has provided me with another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain had killed him. And to Seth, in turn, a son was born, and he named him Enosh. It was then the men began to invoke the Lord by name.
Thank you so much. So this is one of these stories, I think, usually when you're in synagogue, it kind of goes by and it's like, this is a weird little generation story. But giving it a read now, as we had together with Serene's beautiful reading, what do you think, if you had to give this story a title, what do you think this story, what would you give it? Or alternatively, what would you say this story is really about? You can throw it out there, just a couple words. You can unmute and mute.
Generations.
Generations. So this is an ancestry.com. We've got a couple documents that have been pulled in from the Census Bureau on Lamech and Cain's descendants, and so he can look up where all this stuff came from. Yeah, so there's a focus on generations here for sure. Any other thoughts on what the main point or main theme of this particular narrative is?
This is Julie. I think it has to do with setting the scene for what's going to come next. So you've got a context now and a kind of footnote telling you this happened, and therefore next thing happened.
So absolutely. There is a bridge, one thing Julie's pointing out that I think is very wise is that, in the Bible, there's usually kind of like a dichotomy. There's kind of like two kids, and one of the kids is a little more on the path of God in some ways. And here we had Cain and Abel was one of them. And so we have Cain's line, but there's no more Abel. At the end, we're going to have the line of Seth, of Shet. And he actually is going to be the more of the sort of the chosen line, which is going to follow next in Genesis 5, Elo Todot HaAdam, which is actually there's a beautiful next chapter. So again, but there's a lot of information. We could have just had a general generations, but we have instead a song, and we have all these ancestors of people responsible for the major components of civilization, right? So we could get back and forth. I'll give you my take on this particular text. It's partly informed by Leon Kass, who wrote a book called The Beginning of Wisdom. And that is that this is about civilization. That Cain's descendants actually are really part of inventing the major tech innovations in civilization back then. Cain's son, first scene, he builds a city. This wandering guy, you're going to wander the world. And what does he do? He founds a city. And he names the city after his kid. He's the first city builder. And his ancestors, once you get down to the 6th and 7th generations, are the inventors of animal husbandry, metallurgy, and music, right? Yabal, he does the animal husbandry, getting into the livestock management. Yuval is the maker of musical instruments, and Tuval-Cain is the maker of copper and iron and instruments of both of violence theoretically, but also tools of technology. So we could get deep into this, but what does the story teach us about music? This is what I would contend about it. First, I think here we learn that music is a form of power. It evolves along other forms of power, other technologies in ancient civilization. But here we also allude that music is, at best, I would say, morally neutral. It's not inherently good. Now, usually I don't get very popular as the Cantor saying, hey, music is morally neutral. You don't really get many jobs saying that. But it's actually quite telling here. The first song in the Bible is Adam's song when he sees Eve and says, whoa, this is the bone of my bone. It's a song of desire. This is the second song in the Bible, and it's about polygamy and violence. Ada betzila shma'an kuli nishei ha'azine imati ki isharati v'kvitzi v'yel chaburati im shivatayim yukam kayim v'lemech shivim v'shiv'ah. Ancient mic drop. The mic is probably made of like a stick or something. Main point is this. This is like the first, this song would be fitting in certain subgenres of punk and rap, right? This is like, hear up to my two, partners. A person will wound me, I will kill him. Even if a kid poked me, I would slay him, right? If you think that if you think that God's vengeance on Cain was bad, mine is 11 times worse. We might be shocked, right? But I don't think we should be particularly surprised. That music is actually linked to those Freudian drives that we learn about of sex and violence. I don't know, Cantors don't usually talk about this kind of stuff, but this is the messy history of Jewish music, not just the beautiful, clean one. Think, those of you who had to take, you guys are of the generation that you actually had to learn about the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? People had to study the Epic of Gilgamesh and all these old stories in literature class. Some of you maybe. This is very like the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Epic boasting we learned about. Or think of the goddess Athena in Greek religion. She was simultaneously both the goddess of music and of war. Actually, if we look closer at this source, if you look in Genesis, it's quite striking. All the things that Cain's descendants are good at are pretty much associated with the goddess Athena. She's the protector of cities, like Enoch. She's the goddess of handicrafts, like Tubal-Cain, and also of wisdom, art, literature, and music, Yuval. She's basically the goddess of urban civilization, which makes it even more clear that we are looking at Cain's descendants as the ancestors of urban civilization in an Israelite context. But the association between music and our more primal drives goes even deeper than this. After all, making ancient musical instruments involves killing animals or repurposing the weapons used to kill them. Flute from bones, drums from animal hide. If you've been to like the Native American Museum or if you like study that culture, you can feel this, right? Shofars from the ram's horn. Even the harp is hypothesized to be merely the hunter's bow with strings. Ted Gioia, in his book Music, A Subversive History, whose insights were a big inspiration for some of my hashkafa, some of my outlook on this, points out that the music cultures of ancient Mesopotamia were filled with these songs of epic boasting and hypermasculinity, or with erotic hymns to accompany ecstatic fertility rituals that really, I can't really describe them. You could only probably show them on HBO. So, main point is this. It's against this backdrop of song that's linked to eroticism and violence that the Torah is coming to teach a different way of thinking about music. Now, I bet that some of you feel a little uncomfortable. This is an uncomfortable history of music, that it has to do with expression in actually its more problematic forms, right? How we use power, we can be used for good and also for evil, right? So we've learned from music as a form of power and morally neutral and deeply connected towards human drives. And finally, we notice in this text that music in Genesis is not divine, right? We think of music as this gift from God, but here it actually comes from people. With Athena and so many mythologies, music is seen as a gift from the gods. If you look at Native American mythologies, for those of you who have read J.R.R. Tolkien, those books, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, if you are a real nerd in those, and you try to read his Middle Earth mythology, the Silmarillion, you'll notice this too, that the Valar, the gods, sing the world into existence. And Melkor, the bad guy, the sort of Satan figure, is the guy who sings dissonantly, sings out of tune. But in Torah, we notice that music may be the food of love or desire or even of war, but it is not divine. Quite the opposite. God in Genesis speaks the world into existence. He doesn't sing it. I'm not here to tell you that music is bad. That's not what we're learning today or for the rest of the weeks. But I want a sober look at the Torah's first anthropology of music has to recognize the context and conflicts around its origins. Perhaps like the way that the rabbis will later describe the Yetzer Hara, music is which is all called the evil inclination, but it's really more just human, the id, the human drive. Music is a force that is in our DNA. It's an expressive outlet without which we cannot live. Those who have seen Star Trek, there's a wonderful episode where Kirk is split into two, the original Star Trek. I think it's called is it The Enemy Within? No. Someone will put in the chat which episode this is. It's like number 14 of the first series of Star Trek. Where Kirk is put in two, and he has the human drive version, and then the all good version. And they don't work separate. They only work together. Like the rabbis say, if there was no Yetzer, if people had no drive, people would not have kids, they would not build houses, they would not support their families. So, since beauty and goodness are not the same in Torah, we must discover, and in a Jewish way of living, must discover how music will be channeled by a people who are in relationship with God. So speaking of that, this shows our short coda, which I want to come back to on this sheet briefly at the end, which Sarah read so beautifully. And our second reader, if you want to think about coming up to the fore, I will be calling on you soon. It says that after this whole gangster rap song, we have that Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth, meaning God has provided me another offspring of Abel, for Cain had killed him. And then to Seth, in turn, a son was born, and he was named Enosh. It was then that men began to invoke the Lord by name. So it's from this experience of music gone wrong, of civilization gone wrong, of society that gone wrong, that Adam, he has another child, he rebuilds himself, and then that child has a child, he's his first grandkid from this line, and then people are able to reach out to God. That sometimes it's not and by the way, Enosh, this word Enosh, really means, it means human frailty. It doesn't just mean humanity. Like, it means humanity, like in the sense of, we're all human. So, looking beyond the excesses of how people use technical civilization, music included, that relationship with God, that place of vulnerability, is actually where Adam and his line build to the next generation, and people are able to talk to God. So, all right, we're thinking about, and we're going to move forward to the silent sanctuary, but first, back to our Nigun for today. I nai 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 na na nai 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 I nai 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 I na na nai 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 I nai 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 na na nai nai I nai 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 I nai nai I nai nai na na nai 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 na na nai 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 I na na nai nai na na nai 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 I nai nai na nai 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 I na na nai nai na na nai 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 I nai nai I nai nai na na nai nai שירו זמרו לו שיחקו בכל נפלאותיו שירו זמרו לו שיחקו בכל נפלאותיו. Now, our next stop on our journey, by the way, thank you to Randy Wynn. The title of that Star Trek episode is The Enemy Within. It is an excellent way to teach adults and even, I've used it with Hebrew school and kids and teens about the Yetzer Hara and what it means that our human drives are not all bad. They have to be just channeled. They have to be channeled because they can be used for good and evil. Like when you're given a loudspeaker, you can, say great things, or you can, say bad things. It's just a loudspeaker, and it needs to be used for good.
Chazan, before we
yes,
leave
please go ahead.
I just would like to highlight the connection between Yuval and our word jubilee. Maybe there's a connection there. What do you think?
Yes, the words Yovel and Yuval are connected. The Yovel is the Jubilee year in which everyone goes free. from indentured servitude, which land is returned. I'd have to look up the exact root of that word, which I can't tell you with precision right now, but I appreciate that Cantor Simon has brought that to our attention. In fact, the journal, the major journal of Jewish musicology that came out of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem is called Yuval. It's named after that gentleman. And so, there actually, one could do a really interesting study on how Yuval has been understood over time in Jewish sources. Most of them, I think, they have understood him quite positively because they saw music as a good in people's lives, as well it should. But early Genesis is a little more in the middle, I would say, in my opinion. But anyone can feel free to disagree or write to me about any of this. But let's move forward. A short stop forward on our journey from the Genesis 4 are now moving to the rituals of the Mishkan, the portable tent inaugurated in the book of Exodus, and which was the movable center for the worship of God until the building of the Jerusalem temple. Now, something we may not know about this is it was actually a very quiet place. Ever come to shul and you just want to sit there and be quiet? Sometimes shul is even, when the cantor is davening, whoever is davening, sometimes shul is the only quiet place there is. There's people who want to see you, but you can just sit. That's why sometimes, people want more and more congregational singing, and I love that a lot. I mean, it's something I do. But sometimes when it's 9, you can't start at 9:15 or 9 o'clock, like with all your koyach. Sometimes people just need to sit, and that's good too. And indeed, in the Holy of Holies, it was a very quiet place. So is the Bible scholar Yechezkel Kaufman and more contemporarily Israel Knoll point out that the priestly rituals in the Mishkan, in the tent of meeting, the portable sanctuary for God, were predominantly silent. They were quiet. Prayer and song, which were very common among Near Eastern pagans and sacrificial cults, were quite noticeably absent. Prayer and song were a part of Israelite life. People played, they had instruments. Clearly, there was a whole tradition. You couldn't have the song at the sea without people being musical, because they were. But they were not. But approaching the Holy of Holies, where God, the unseeable God, was present, all was quite silent. I suggest we should think about this as actually a Torah that we learned about, relates to what we learned about music as a form of power. That priests were perhaps minimizing sonic statements of human power before the ultimate power, the King of Kings. Also perhaps avoiding any possibility hint that they were trying to force the hand or do magic to control the Holy One. Now, there are theologies, and they're the main ones that we know about Israelites, that emphasize a personal relationship to God, who is moved by your prayers and your songs. But in that priestly sphere, in these Levitical documents, silence was golden. Or as the Tehillim say, Lecha dumiyah tehillah, to you, God, silence is prayer. Now, with this priestly ideal of silence or minimal speech in sacrificial music, how is it that we got to the glory days of the temple orchestra and choir at the sacrificial altar? For that, we have to move to our favorite warrior musician who played the sacred chord, King David. So for the heart of our study today, for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to read the story of the inauguration of the temple orchestra. And I'm going to tell you that this last 20 minutes, I'm going to take us really to 10 o'clock before I take questions, just to let you know. I apologize in advance. And if we need to shorten it for next time, I certainly will. We're going to read the story of the inauguration of the temple orchestra, and we're going to do it in 2 parallel texts, because the whole story occurs twice. In the book of Samuel, which is a prophetic book, and in the book of Chronicles, which is a priestly book. Anyone ever watch the same story on 2 different news channels? Yes? It's a quite crazy experience sometimes. Sometimes you get 2 very different stories, both of which illuminate David's quite disruptive innovation and what it means for the Jewish people, but very different coverage. So let's first flip to CBS. the Chronicles broadcasting station, which has great music coverage, I would say. Let's see how they cover this event of David's musical reformation. I need a reader. This is a little long-form journalism. I need someone who's willing to read perhaps a long-ish source. This is just the second page, but really read the whole thing through chapter 15 through chapter 16, the whole page. Can I get a reporter live from CBS?
This is Ronnie. I'll read.
Thank you, Ronnie.
After David had constructed buildings for himself in the city of David, he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, "No one but the Levites may carry the ark of God, because the Lord chose them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before him forever." So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the poles, as Moses had commanded, according to the word of the Lord. David also commanded the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brothers as the singers who should play loudly on musical instruments, on harps and lyres and cymbals, to raise sounds of joy. Now, David was dressed in a robe of fine linen, as were all the Levites who were carrying the ark, as well as the singers and Hananiah, the director of music for the singers. Am I pronouncing that name right?
Yes.
Hananiah? Okay. David also wore a linen ephod. So all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouting, with the sounding of ram's horns and trumpets, and with cymbals and the music of harps and lyres. As the ark of the covenant of the Lord was entering the city of David, Saul's daughter Michal looked down from a window and saw King David dancing and celebrating, and she despised him in her heart. So they brought the ark of God and placed it inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And they presented burnt offerings and peace offerings before God. When David had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord. Then he distributed to every man and woman of Israel a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake. David appointed some of the Levites to minister before the ark of the Lord, to celebrate, to give thanks, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel. Asaph was the chief, Zechariah was second, then Jael, Shemiramoth, Jehiel, Mattithiah, Eliab, Benaiah, Obed-Edom, and Jael. They were to play the harps and lyres while Asaph sounded the cymbals. And the priests, Benaniah and Jehaziel, blew the trumpets regularly before the ark of the covenant of God.
Thank you, Ronnie. I should have known Ronnie and I were just recording for the Kristallnacht program, and Ronnie is an excellent speaker, and once again here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.
So in this version of the story of David, we notice that David has newly appointed a group of Levites to be the Shul Band, the core musicians who will regularly serve in David's new institutional home for the worship of God in his new capital, Jerusalem, a vision which will be fulfilled by his son Solomon. You notice that CBS Chronicles Broadcasting loves to tell you all the names of these musicians, Heman, Asaf, Yedutun, and all their roles in temple worship. This is great music journalism. Chronicles in general, as a priestly history, will be very focused on mentioning the temple choirs, orchestra members, musical directors, and actually many specific prayers that were recited, including one that we did today. Shirulo zamrulo sichu bechol nifleotav is actually the continuation of this text in Chronicles 16. Hodu ladonai kiru vishmo, hodiu va'amim alilotav, shirulo zamrulo sichu bechol nifleotav. This is all part of a long double psalm of praise to God, which inaugurates the Levites' work, and we actually put in our morning liturgy a Psukei de Zimra. So honestly, if there's any book of Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, that you could call the cantorial history of the Jewish people, I would say it would be the book of Chronicles. But what does reading this text teach us about David's musical disruption? David, in returning the ark to Jerusalem with all the fervor surrounding it, has introduced musical structure and musical complexity to the sacrificial system. He has broken the former silence before the sacrifices. He's broken the priestly silence. And he has introduced prayer and song with a large musical ensemble of instrumentalists and singers, both male and female, I will have you know. This will be the norm of temple worship until the whole thing goes away. And even in the rebuilding and conduct of the second temple, singers and musicians will make it back to start over, as we read in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Only the second destruction will truly end it all 1 millennium later. This is a 1,000-year long run of an innovation. Why is this important? And what are the other dynamics at play here that teach us about the practice of music? Part of this will be illuminated by changing the channel, or get your clicker, and to the other news station covering this story, which is SNBC, the Samuel National Broadcasting Company. Get cozy, everyone, here, because this is a little more of the, this is going to be a little less clean. This is going to be a little more scandal in this journalism. Can I get a last reader for this station's coverage of this same story? Anyone?
I'll read. I'm Esther.
Thank you, Esther.
David's musical reformation. After David had, can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes. Could you go to the third page? This is the third page of, it says David in the prophet's eye.
Wait a minute. I thought it was, I thought it was in the third page. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart, 4 with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God, because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there before the ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Peretz Uzzah. Now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. While he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Esther, for that in-depth coverage. This is a deeper dive, a very different journalistic take on this story. Anybody, by the way, you may be familiar with this version. It's actually one of the Haftorahs that we read. It's the Haftorah for Parshat Vayikra. So watch it in about maybe 5-6 months from now. And it's such different coverage, right? Look, a bunch of things are going on here. If we were having an extended session, I would actually put you in chavrutas and groups to parse out what are the differences between these two stories. What do they share and what do they not share? It's a little like Rashomon, like that old Kurosawa movie with the 7 scenes, the same scene from 7 different perspectives. But here, to sum it up, here are some of the differences. The context of David's musical arrival to Jerusalem is a tragedy born of neglect. David, as reported by SNBC, has put the reclaimed Ark of the Covenant on a cart, which is totally against the rules. It is supposed to be carried by the Levites. It's supposed to be hand carried. It's supposed to be personal work. Instead, they got this little cart they're pushing. They got, they're not carrying the bags. They've got a grocery cart. And lo and behold, in all of this ecstatic music and praise wailing, an accident happens. The ark falls and a man dies. Whew, what a buzzkill. Note that Chronicles, as usual, is a little more vague, is more generous to David, and only vaguely alludes to the fact that bad stuff may have happened, but David made sure that only the Levites can handle the ark. But Samuel is a prophetic book, and it does not forget sins so easily, no matter who makes them. That's number one. Number two, the Michal story is only in Samuel. It ain't in Chronicles. It depicts a David who was a transgressive Devo. After the bread and circuses, he dances without modesty. He gets home and he tells his wife straight up, and she talks to him kind of sarcastically. "Oh, look how distinguished you are, dancing about half naked." And he says, "I was dancing for God. I'm going to do it again and do it worse. And the lowest of society will hold me in honor." And that's the end of their physical intimacy. Whew! Very different story in this coverage. And number three, there's no program notes for the orchestra. No names, no roles, nothing. Depersonalized. So David in the book of Samuel is really a transgressive musical innovator. He is depicted as an over-the-top, party-hard kind of guy, who is working for God. But you wouldn't know it from the way he acts sometimes. And this is even before the whole Bathsheba incident, which is a whole new level, right? Indeed, David is actually the embodiment of many of the things we saw associated with the line of Cain itself. He's a city builder, like Enoch. He's a shepherd, like Yaval. He plays the lyre, like Yuval. And he wields iron, like Tuval, Cain. So his innovations are perhaps naturally the ones we might expect for the great civilization builder of Israel. But this musical innovator, like Lamech before him, is also reckoning with not just his musical power and his political power, but his inner drives. sometimes, as Samuel shows, to his discredit. But let's circle back in these last 5 minutes to music. We have seen David as a transgressive musical innovator who changes the forms of music centered around the worship of God. But what he does represents something much greater, and that is that his musical innovation is perhaps really an extension of his political innovation and the political change he causes in the Israelite kingdom. Earlier in the book of Samuel, chapter 8 of the first book, the Israelite people will come to the prophet Samuel at Ramah, the original Camp Ramah, and they say to him, "You're old, your sons have not followed in your ways, therefore appoint a king for us to govern us like all of the nations." Samuel asks God about this, and God says, "Hear the demand of the people and everything they say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected, but it is me, God, they have rejected as their king. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them." So Samuel warns them about all the bad stuff that will happen if they have a king: conscription, nepotism, land grabbing, taxation. But the people don't listen. They still want a king to protect them and unite them. This political change from a confederation of tribes to a monarchical nation state is a transformation of society. It will require the creation of a court, of bureaucracy and specialists, and of concentrated power, something which Israelites have not had, but now want for security reasons. So too with music. The creation of complex musical structures, choirs, orchestras, and the like by King David is a parallel to the change of complex governmental and social structures that he institutes. Music hereby is a change agent, powerfully bringing people together through musical forms in ways that they will also be socially organized in new governmental and social forms. Remember, this isn't actually an insidious thing, it's a populist thing. The elders of the people come and say, the people want a king. Hashem gives them one. It is David who coalesces this social transformation, aided by music and ensembles that mirror the power and the form of his new commonwealth. Or, as Ted Gioia would put it, what happens in Israelite society tomorrow can be heard on Israelite radio today. He didn't add the Israelite part, I did. To sum up, we've seen that the first stop on our Temple Till Today narrative, the Temple Orchestra, is really a disruptive innovation of an ascendant King David, the pious yet transgressive sometimes city builder who shatters the silence of the temple and puts musical power and complexity close to the worship of God, which is part of the social transformation of Israelite society from tribes to kingdom. Like we did with Cain's descendants, we must reckon with music as a force of power, a morally neutral technology which is a major engine of this social change, and one which, in the character of David and in general, is connected to human powers and human drives, or as Chazal will one day call them, the Yetzer Hara. We should also note especially David's introduction of hierarchy leads to a music of hierarchy. To bring it back to where most of us are sitting, Sarasota excels at musics of hierarchy, right? In which professional or authoritative figures, conductors, and composers direct an ensemble in complex action. Think of the orchestra, the opera, the ballet, the choir, even musical theater. All of these require a degree of hierarchy to succeed. The social vision suggested by these experiences contrasts with those of improvisational forms like the rock band or the jazz ensemble. Now, I'm not saying that all people who love classical music like me are monarchists. Far from it. But I'm saying that our musical forms say a lot about our ideals. And as we saw today and will continue to see, that's true about Judaism as well. On that perhaps controversial note, I'll now pause and open the floor for questions. And I want to thank Elliot for being our Lord of Hosts, and I look forward to speaking with you about this topic for today. So those with comments, I believe, can unmute, or with questions can unmute.
This is Ronnie. I have a question.
Please.
So could you, I don't know if you know this or if anyone knows this, but where was David in his life? How old was he when this happened that is told to us by both Samuel and the Chronicles? Where was David in his in his journey? Where was he in his life? How old was he?
I think that David at that time is in his late 20s. I have to check it though. I'm really not sure. He's not the teenager. It's really in actually his teenage years from like 15 to 22 that he really does the formation of like of the sort of him and Jonathan and dealing with Saul and everything. At this point he's sort of coming into his own and starting the kingdom. And I think that's in his is at least his mid 20s. But I will and again, the mid 20s back then, and teenagers did a lot of things, right? It was amazing, and teenagers can still do a lot of things. So I think it's that, but I have to double check.
So I'm just curious. At that point in history, of course, 30 was mature, I suppose, but our 22 to 32-year-olds might behave in similar manner today. And we call that follies of youth. I'm just observing that.
That's a good thing to point out. Again, David's excesses as a person, really, could have a lot to do with just his age. People were different and had different, back then, but. They still dealt with their same follies and the books of the prophets are always quick to point out that even the most powerful have those follies. They have those follies at any age. And even David on his deathbed, he has to fix things from his earlier life where he did not lay the law down about succession. He has to really make sure that Solomon inherits and that a coup does not happen. So people are in the prophets. They're always dealing with, as we are, with our good sides and with our Yetzer Hara and how to channel it at any age.
Right.
I see Murray, Cantor Simon raising his hand.
Thank you. Yasher Koach to you. A wonderful presentation. I just want to bring up 2 points that sometimes we allude to. David's use of music. When Saul was king and he was in a depressed mood, David would soothe that mood with playing the harp. So I think this is one of the earliest expressions of music therapy that we come across. Mentioned in the Bible. That's one thing. Another thing I'd like to point out, and sometimes when I teach music in the Bible, I will inform people that in the temple in Jerusalem, there was an organ. It's called a magrefa. People would always sort of be taken aback to hear that we had such a thing as an organ. They always associated with Christian music and Christian worship. But there was an organ in the temple. It was a water organ. It said that it had 10,000 pipes and was very loud, and it was used for signaling people to come to worship. So yes, besides an orchestra in the temple, there was an organ, magrefa.
Thank you. I appreciate both of those points a lot. Cantor Simon brings up. They're very important. It's important to know about David that, remember, he's a shepherd. And he has the musical technology of shepherds. And what do shepherds need to do when they play music? They need to soothe their sheep. You can even divide Ted Gioia teaches this in his book, Music: A Subversive History. A lot of hip music history can be divided into, the farmer and the cowman. Right, or not? Well, not the farmer and the cowman. The warrior and the shepherd, or the nomadic tribe and the shepherd. The warrior tribe needs to play drums, needs to make other people go away. They're on the move, but the shepherd needs to soothe the sheep. I once experienced this in Jewish music in a very bizarre way. I was listening to Shlomo Carlebach, and I heard him opening a piece with a whistle. There was a guitar with it, and there was just a little just a little strumming guitar and the flute and maybe the whistle. And I thought to myself, what does this sound like? this sounds like Ennio Morricone. This sounds like A Fistful of Dollars, right? You guys have seen these old spaghetti western films, right? Some of us here. This sounds like shepherd music. It's just modern shepherd music from the cowboys they were imitating cowboy music out there when they were filming in Italy. And so Shlomo Carlebach is just shepherding people with the same style of music that spaghetti westerns use to herd cattle. And so King David is using the same tech of the lyre, of the the ancient guitar, basically, to soothe people, to soothe Saul. He has great musical power, and therefore he's a great music therapist because he knows how to move his flock and to calm it down. On the Magretha, very important that, yes, there is musical complexity, not just in amount of musicians, but in types of instrument. I was trying to find them on my computer. I might be able to find it. As right now, I'm writing an article called "Jewish Music in the Age of Shakespeare" from 1550 to 1650, sort of from the entirety of the European continent. And I'm working on the organ's use in Prague. And there is a picture in 1494 of an organ in a synagogue. It is a positive. It is a small upright organ. It's not one of these Größer, gigantic room-filling things. It's a single thing, and there's a little guy playing on it. There were experiments long before Reform, and were actually part of Reform movements contesting of musical instruments in Jewel. Like, hey, look in Prague, look in Venice. They used it there. It's fine. So again, with complexity in music, rabbis and thinkers are always looking back to the Bible to justify these innovations, because the Bible and the temple is really the root narrative of musical complexity for Jewish life, or one of them at least, the big one. So thank you to Cantor Simon for pointing that out. Other comments and questions? I see Don and Julie, and then Lois.
Okay, pardon me, but my Jewish education did not include Gilgamesh. Can you talk a little bit about this reference?
Yes. So there's an ancient Mesopotamian narrative. It is actually quite related to the story of Noah, called the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh is trying to achieve eternal life. Forget the exact, which Mesopotamian civilization it is, if it's the Assyrians. But if you Google Gilgamesh, it's one of these sort of hero stories from the ancient Near East. And it's, I remember when I was in high school and middle school, we were taught it in order to learn this ancient style of what's called epic boasting, where the hero would say about, oh, I did all this and I conquered this and I did this, and they'd spill lots and lots of ink on parchment on how great they were. And to me, it reminded me very much of the very succinct version we get from Lamech, boasting of his prowess, not his moral prowess certainly, but his willingness to do violence to other people. So that if you Google Gilgamesh, it's one of these, and they use this narrative, by the way, because there's a flood story in it to see how the Israelite flood story is different from those of surrounding cultures. Great. I see Lois, and then I have a question from Randy in the chat.
My question has to deal with the development of music. What we have learned in music history in this secular world is that it sort of starts with the Gregorian chant, which is clearly after the time of our temple music. And that was sort of a non-harmonic kind of music. Two questions. Number one, can you recommend a book that might give us the history of Jewish music from that point of view? And number two, could you just make a comment on what the early Jewish music was like from the point of view of harmony and the complexity of developing into parallel what we have in the secular world today?
Sure. Thank you, Lois. I'm putting the two book recommendations I have in the chat. One is older, the other is newer. This relationship between plain chant and Christian worship music and the temple is one I am not very versed in, but there is a book that was written about it called The Sacred Bridge by Eric Werner, I think in the 80s. So the Sacred Bridge by Eric Werner is one, but there's not been a lot of scholarship on this stuff. So when I finish my PhD, maybe I'll look at it. The second
Eric
book
Werner,
is,
excuse me, Chazan.
Yes.
I studied with Eric Werner.
Yes.
Of blessed memory. The Sacred Bridge it's a huge book, and its basic thrust is that Gregorian chant is based on Hebrew chant from the Bible. We always think of it as the other way around, that Gregorian chant was first and that Western music came and Jewish music came from that. But he proposes that it was the opposite, that Gregorian chant was based, because after all, the earliest Christians were Jews, and that they took the format and the modes that we used for prayer and created Gregorian chant. That's his supposition in the Sacred Bridge.
Thank you. I love having other cantors on this because, you know, I know I only know so much, but you know Eric Werner, you've studied with him directly. That's fantastic. You know, it's funny. I can neither confirm nor deny Werner's hypothesis, but I do know that Jews actually pick it up for themselves in the Middle Ages. There's this idea that the Christians stole art music from us. And it's as early as Dante's friend, Dante of like Dante Alighieri, has a friend named Emmanuel Haromi, Emmanuel of Rome. And he writes, Ma omer chochamot ha-muzika notzrim ganov ganuvti me'eretz ha'ivrim. He says, what does the science of music, the study of music, say to the Christians? I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. Now, how he comes to say that is so chutzpah. I mean, there's things that happen like this all the time throughout Jewish history. When Jews first encountered Western philosophy in the Greeks, there was a whole movement of Jews who were like, they stole this from us. This is ours. We're stoic in a way, right? This is how the rabbis became basic. If you read the book Aphrodite and the Jews and the Aphrodite and the Rabbis by Bert Rozatsky, he says like, look, the rabbis were basically great stoics, and they knew all these, you know, fox stories and animal stories that were currency among Greek philosophers and Stoic philosophers. So they were of their time. But there's a long tradition of Jews saying, hey, I mean, I like that. That was ours first. But the second thing I'll add, and this is a more recent book, which actually gets to Lois's question of harmony. There is a really great book called The Music Libel Against the Jews. It's by Ruth HaKohen from Hebrew University, which tracks Christian ideas about Jewish music, that Christian music is somehow harmony and Jewish music is noise. And this is actually a trope that goes all the way through. I will talk about it a little next week, but in the fourth week as well. We'll go all the way through Christian caricature of Jews, because the idea is that, you know, this is my sort of, I'm titrating it a little bit, that Jesus died for our sins, and therefore the world is in harmony because of his death. But Jews don't recognize that, and so they live in, and their davening is noisy and yucky and sounds like bees, and that's because they're a despised people who doesn't have harmony or grace. That's the basic thrust of how that argument goes, and actually Christian conceptions of themselves are built musically in contradistinction to Jews. There's a lot there, and we're coming up on our last minute. I want to address Randy's question and then let you go. Randy wanted to ask about the role of women in temple music. Did they do singing or playing of instruments? The women, I think, are described as the singers. There's male singers and female singers who are described coming back from Babylon with Ezra and Nehemiah in those books, in the writings. Whether they picked up female and female singers from being in Babylon or not, I don't know, but they come back. But women, actually, there's a long history of women playing drums. Now, women playing frame drums actually is an old pagan thing. You can go really far back into women as sort of these ecstatic rituals, and they would use frame drums just like Miriam. But Miriam doesn't use it in the same way. But the association between women and drumming is a really old association with very powerful pagan and magical associations with it, and which takes a turn, but is still part of Israelite society. with that, I am going to be Yeka and say it's 10:15. So if you want to talk to me a little more, I'll stay on for another 5 minutes. But I just want to thank Elliot for being our host. Thank you so much to our readers today, to Esther, to Ronnie, and to Serenay. And if you have any questions, you can stay on for another 5 minutes, or please write me at mosterklein@templebethshalomfl.org. And we'll be back next week with a little more from my my PhD work on musical innovations in the early modern era.
Meanwhile, they took the organ from the Jews.
Well, the organ is, I'm not a great organologist in terms of music history, but certainly the organ was, all, what makes something Jewish is not that, is how it is used, not what it is. It's like the organ is something you can find in a lot of civilizations, but what made it Jewish was how the organ was used. Same thing like the Code of Hammurabi, you can find around a lot. But when you take the Code of Hammurabi and make it equal so that punishments are equal no matter who you are, you get, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth in the Torah. So Judaism is actually more process than product, I would say. And that applies to music and law and a lot of different things. So, everyone's stealing from each other. In some ways, I would say music is one of the most promiscuous cultural forms because you can just hear it and then it becomes yours. It's you can't do that with art. You have to learn the whole technique. But you can hear someone sing something. There's actually a wonderful exploration of this. The traditional melody for Kol Mekadesh Shvi'i, one of the Sabbath Zmiras, one of the Sabbath table songs. One of these scholars in Israel, Naomi Cohen-Zentner, found it in a Christian hymnal circa 1590 or so. It's a Catholic hymn, and it totally got lifted. And actually, there's a little machlokes, the rabbis are uncomfortable with this for a little while, but it becomes the standard Kol Mekadesh Shvi'i song for Western German Jews. So everyone's always stealing back and forth, but I think it's much about process as product.
They took the organ from us.
Okay.
Cantor, Esther Klein, it's Neil Newman.
Hi, Neil.
Thank you so much for your brilliant and entertaining class. It was fantastic. Tada.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you. My pleasure.
This is Julie. Dawn and I also wish to thank you so much for this presentation. Can't imagine how much work has gone into preparing this. One of the topics, I think Ronnie might have put it in the chat box, was the role of women in music. Now Kol Isha is just, no in the Orthodox community. But is that also one of the things that the rabbis decided was no good, but it was there in the temple?
I can't tell you as much about the history of Kol Isha. I think it's more of a medieval. No, it is a Talmudic thing in some to some, but the context of it, I think, is disputed. I can tell you that actually women had vocal roles they still do really in many cultures. This is not uniquely Jewish, but as wailers, as at funeral, as wailing at a funeral. Yeah. In the Talmud, it said that you should not. At a funeral, you shouldn't have less than 2 flutes and a wailing woman for a funeral. Isn't that interesting? Because, and I'll talk about this when I'm here in person for my class in December, is going to be called A Jewish Guide to the Orchestra. We're going to go through all 4 sections of the orchestra and see how they progress in Jewish sources in the Bible throughout Jewish history. But that flutes were associated with mourning, and women had an active vocal process in that. Part of that. Other than that, it varies. Women's role in music starts to pick up a little in the 17th century. And a lot of times, like, for example, women, German women in Hamburg were like learning piano at home. It's sort of anticipating by 150 years, the women learning piano in Victorian society. It's a great, you stay at home, the potential husband comes and hears you play piano. It was like a courting thing, but it was part of German society and they picked it up too. But there's also a tradition of female cantors, female prayer leaders. It's called the Fürsorgerin or the Zogerke. and that history, you can write me. I have an article about it. And they were, as early as the 13th century. We have a gravestone of Urania of Worms. Her dad was a big singer in shul. He was a cantor, and she sang piyutim. She sang sacred poems for the women's section in Worms. So there's a thin but very quite beautiful thread of women prayer leaders that kind of got shut down a little bit once in modernity, and I think we need to reboot because it's some good history.
Thank you.
Very good. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. All right, I will see you next week at 9 a.m. for our next section. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cantor. It was a great program.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.